Don't put the USB in. But it's not probably Russian hack.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Tuesday, January 11th, 2022 Public Works Committee meeting. Now it's time for roll call and determination of quorum.
Evans. Stroman.
Here.
Roberts.
Here.
Jones. Armstrong.
Present.
A quorum is present.
Thank you. Now it's time for the adoption of the agenda. Have a motion to adopt by Councilman Stroman, a second by Councilman Evans. All in favor, say aye. Aye. All opposed, motion passes. Now it's time for general public comment. This is a time for members of the public to discuss or express concerns to the committee on any issue not limited to items on the agenda. Action will not be taken at the meeting on any issue not on the agenda, except by placement on the agenda by unanimous vote of the council members present. I don't see anybody jumping up and down for general public comment, so I opened it and closed it. I know we have a speaker on item 3. Would you like to speak on that?
Yes.
Right at the moment? Okay.
If I may, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to introduce Paul Kraft with Long Branch Engineering. Paul and his firm did the work on the Lime Creek flood study, and he's here to present the findings on that.
We're all ears.
All right. Everybody can hear me all right? All right. Thanks again for having me out here. As Dale pointed out, I'm here to kind of show the results of our floodplain study over on Lime Creek. So I kind of wanted to go over kind of a brief overview of, the area that we're talking about, some of our findings, why we're actually, why we did the study, and ultimately what's going to kind of happen next. So looking at the study area, so trying to orientate yourself. Let's see here. So looking over at Storybook Island over on the west side, basically Lime Creek ends up draining all the way into Rapid Creek over by Storybook Island. If you ever kind of wondered what that creek is over by the Sunken Gardens, that happens to be Lime Creek. In total, there's about 10 square miles that drain all into this area. To kind of get some other markings over here. At the northern part, you have St. Martin Village over by the monastery. That's kind of the northern limits. Stephen High School is also part of this. And even going further out 3 miles past the city limits, that's basically kind of the boundaries of this area. So quite a substantial amount of area to take a look at, and the amount of contributing area that ultimately drains out into Rapid Creek and poses a lot of water issues for the area. One thing to note is about 3 years ago or so, there's about 6 square miles that's highlighted there in white that was previously studied through FEMA and updated the floodplain. So the areas that I ended up actually studying were the parts in blue. So you can see there's up to the north side, that is the main Lime Creek channel. The part in the white is what's called the South Canyon tributary, and the portion that kind of runs north of Stevens High School, we've named that the Stevens tributary. So why restudy this drainage area? The original FEMA study was completed back in the 1980s with minimal updates since then. This new updated study includes updated topography information, so we have better information of how high our hills are, how deep our valleys are, a lot more detail when it comes to that. Then we also updated the hydrologic model. So that's basically a fancy way of putting in, determining how much water is actually generated in a given area. Then there's the hydraulic model, which then determines, once you know how much water there is, where all that water goes, how fast it's going, where it spreads, that kind of thing. And then ultimately you take all that information and you end up updating mapping. So in this case here, we're updating the FEMA floodplain maps. To kind of take a look at some examples of what those maps look like, on the left side is what you end up seeing when you open up Rapid Map and turn on the floodplain layers. So the ones that we're dealing with is what you're seeing in red and blue is called the 100-year floodplain. Basically, what you're looking at is probabilities put onto a map. So the 100-year floodplain is basically in a given 100 years, there's a one-time chance that this flooding event actually goes out to those boundaries. So think the 100-year event is 1 in 100. The 500-year event, which is there in orange, that's 1 in 500. The floodway is basically your blue area, that 100-year floodplain, but is basically your higher risk of basically causing issues with anything is in that area. So kind of imagine that you're sitting in a ditch. If you're off to the edge of the ditch, probably less water is hitting you, but if you're down in the center of that ditch, you have more water hitting you. There's more damage that can be done, so there's a little higher risk. That's why it's in red. Looking over on the right side, that's the official FEMA map, so that area highlighted in green is the same thing you're looking at over on the Rapid Map image on your left. You just note that we don't have color on that side. Again, that was developed in the 80s, so we're stuck with black, white, some shading, that kind of thing. So with the updated topography, the original FEMA study utilized low-resolution topography information. This does not provide the necessary detail when you're looking at developed areas, when you have buildings, homes going up, people are going to use these areas. You want a little more detail to determine where all this water is going. The location of the existing floodplain does not coincide with the topography of the area. So this area on Clover Street is a pretty good example. So if you're looking at these colors here, the red and blue, again, that's the 100-year floodplain. That's what's currently the existing floodplain right now, the effective floodplain. So it's saying that this house that's over there, that 4,000 and that 3090 Clover Street houses, that they're in the floodplain. In reality, they're actually sitting about 10 to 15 feet above the creek. So clearly there's some mapping issues over there. So as part of this study, we can actually get updated topography and make sure that the floodplain is accurately showing what's actually going on. So the one thing that helps out a lot is back in 2015, the City of Rapid City obtained highly detailed LIDAR information. So basically, that is a really fancy way of saying the city got to use a bunch of lasers. They got a plane, shot lasers onto the ground, and you're able to get an amazing amount of detail. As you can see over here, you can make out houses, trees, roads, that kind of thing. If you ever kind of wondered, for those of you who have like an iPhone that have a Face ID, how that reads your face, it's basically doing the same thing. It's shooting a laser at your face, determining how close your nose, your face, and all that is to the camera, and then determining, yeah, that's who you are. Basically the same thing, but on a much bigger scale. With that, then, we need to determine how much water is actually being generated. So what you're seeing here on the right is basically the computer's interpretation of all the areas that we looked at with the inputted new soil data, weather data, land zoning, detention ponds that have been installed since everything's been completed, along with storm sewer bypasses from projects from the past. So basically, all this data gets put on here just to determine how much water at any given point in that model. You can basically click on any point of there and determine how much water is actually showing up in the model. From that, we now know how much water is being generated. Now we need to know what that water is exactly doing. So that's where the hydraulics portion comes in. So there's another piece of software that we basically go along the creek and cut cross sections along this area, and then take the amount of water, put it into those cross sections, and that determines how far that water, how deep it is, how far it spreads, how fast it goes. That's what that modeling ultimately ends up doing. And then once again, as you take all that information, put it together, that's when you can start updating some of the maps. So what you're kind of seeing here is the preliminary, well, I should say the almost finalized here. It hasn't become effective yet. This is through FEMA. This Lomar case is case number 21080301P. And this has been accepted by FEMA, these new mapping lines, but it won't become actually effective until April 4th of 2022. Basically what that just means is right now the current floodplain that you see there in the shaded areas, that's going to be the floodplain that FEMA says is the floodplain until April 4th of this year. Once that date clicks over, then the new mapping takes effect. So what I want to kind of show here in some of these next slides are some of the examples of some of the changes that we're able to see with the new mapping. In particular, you can kind of see some of the issues that were before in the old mapping compared to what the new mapping shows. Quite specifically, if you're looking at Brookside Drive, what you're seeing shaded there in blue was the old floodplain. You can see right now that dark blue line is what the new floodplain is representing. You can see a majority of those homes there along Brookside Drive are actually coming out of the floodplain. Some things to note too, if you look kind of north close to those houses over along Hall Street, there's a section of grove of trees there. You can see between those two purple magenta lines kind of on the right side of that image. The creek's actually over there, but the old FEMA mapping is showing that it's way to the south. So with this updated mapping, you get a little more accurate idea of what's actually going on in that area. Some of the other things to take a look at too is then we can also show bypass flowing. So, once all this water is flowing through there, when it hits streets, well, sometimes it goes onto one street, overflows, goes onto another street or maybe a creek, and that's what you're kind of seeing over here. There's basically some of these houses are on little islands, so presumably when these types of flood events happen, they're going to be basically little islands and the water's going to go around some of these homes. Some of the other things too, looking at here, just some of the, you can see some of those houses along West Chicago Street. A lot of those houses are actually going to be coming out of the floodplain. Just again, because of that updated topography information, you're able to get a lot more detail of what the water is actually doing in these areas. Clover Street, so this is the example that I used before. That home that's about 10, 15 feet above the actual creek, you can see here, we're able to actually take them out of the floodplain and show that the water is in the lower portion of the drainage area. One thing to also note too, I kind of mentioned that there's kind of three drainage areas in here. There's Lime Creek, the main one, which is the ones we just looked at. There's the South Canyon, that was at that big white image area, that about 6 square miles I talked about previously. Then there was the Stevens tributary, and FEMA did originally put a FEMA floodplain on this area, which you can kind of see here in this blue, but it's called a Zone A. Basically what that means is there was no hydrologic or hydraulic model that was ever actually developed on this. It was basically somebody's best guess of kind of looking at a map and knowing, hey, it's a low area, there probably is water that goes through here. We'll put some lines in here to kind of tell people, yeah, expect that there should be some flooding issues in here. As part of this project, we restudied part of the Stevens tributary, so that way we can actually have some definitive boundaries of where we presume that this flooding is going to happen. And as you can see here, we've been able to greatly narrow the amount of floodplain area through this section. Do note too, over to the very left side, that you see all of a sudden that blue just gets truncated and goes away. Do know that that doesn't mean that there's no flooding that's possible in that area. It just means that that study, that original Zone A floodplain that FEMA put in there, they just stopped the study right there. That was the limits of it. We actually went through and went further to the west towards Stevens High School, so that way we could actually go through the drainage and determine what the floodplain risks are in that area. So that way, if property owners in this area, they can determine, if they are at risk of issues with flooding, as well as any new development in this area, because this is kind of the last of these open areas here, that if at some point somebody decides that they want to develop this area, they at least know the risks in it. So in total, what you're seeing here on the image to the right is basically all of the affected properties that are, all the properties that are affected by the floodplain along Lime Creek and Stevens Tributary. In total, there's about 355 total properties that are effective. Right now, there are about 85 structures that I could see that are in the floodplain, the 100-year floodplain. After this restudy becomes effective, that amount of structures basically gets halved down to 45. So you can see just by restudying it, we've been able to have the amount of structures that are actually in the floodplain. So now what can homeowners expect here in the future? So the first one is that individual mailings are going to be sent to all the affected property owners. This is going to happen here about at the end of the month, so every property owner is going to get a little letter describing kind of what I'm talking about right now, what went on with the project, what the findings were, and additionally there'll be a little exhibit kind of showing here's what the new floodplain is going to be, here's what it was before, here's what it is now, so that way they can see how it affects their property. All this new mapping becomes effective April 4th of 2022. Additionally, if a structure has been removed from the 100-year floodplain, floodplain insurance may no longer be required. So seeing those highlighted addresses that you see there in yellow, so those properties potentially could get out of doing floodplain insurance if they contact their lenders, things like that. So then talking a little bit about a flood insurance, that's under the National Flood Insurance Program, the NFIP. So flood insurance is required for all properties that are, or all structures that are in a FEMA floodplain that are federally backed mortgages. Some private mortgages will also do require that the floodplain insurance does get initiated. do keep in mind that coverage is meant for reimbursement of structures. So this does not include things like fences, cars. If you had a leaky faucet, the mold and mildew and things that happen that's not flood related, those things won't be covered. Most policies can be purchased through your insurance agent. For more information, by all means, direct people to the floodsmart.gov website. So some more information about flood insurance. You don't have to be in a floodplain to buy floodplain insurance. So as I kind of said earlier, all these maps are basically probability maps. What's your risk of an accident happening? So for instance, all these people in the colored areas, yes, for people in the blue and that red striped area, if they had a federally backed mortgage, they would be required to get floodplain insurance, but for those people that are just in the regular image outside of all the shading and all of that, they could also ask for floodplain insurance, and because they're out of the higher risk area, they're probably eligible to have lower rates than the people closer into the floodplain area. So one thing I always kind of try when I talk to people about floodplain insurance is think of it like car insurance. The closer you are to a risk, the higher the premium. To kind of put a perspective, you know, we say this 100-year storm, 500-year storm, what does that really mean? So in your lifetime, you have about a 1 in 103 odds of being in a fatal motor vehicle accident. In that same respect, that blue and red area that you're seeing in the floodplain, that's a 1 in 100 odds of happening there. So why don't you protect your most expensive asset? You know, we're very easy to get car insurance. We should get floodplain insurance for people that are in those high-risk areas and that may have flooding issues. So who can be contacted about these changes? The big one is Public Works. I listed the phone number on there. You can also contact Mary Bosworth. She is your floodplain administrator in Public Works. Actually, she's sitting right over there. Additional information is actually on the city's website. If you go to the city's website and go under Public Works Engineering Services, and at the very bottom of the page, there's floodplain management, kind of highlighted that over there in that little image. There's plenty of information about the current floodplain studies that have gone on here in the past years, other things that, you know, property owners can take a look at, that by all means, for people to be directed there to go take a look at some of the ways they can mitigate some of their flooding issues. And again, the rapid map will be updated after the map revisions are finalized. So after that April 4th, 2022 date, when these new maps be affected or will become affected, do about a week, 2 weeks after that, that's when rapid map will be updated with the new boundaries. And with that, this would be the end part of the presentation, so open up for any questions that you guys might have.
Thank you very much, and Councilwoman Armstrong has some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Roberts. First and foremost, Mr. Kraft, I believe it is, thank you for a very detailed presentation. I also would like to thank Mary Bosworth. She is an invaluable employee and very knowledgeable in this area. So to both of you, thank you very much. Approximately how many properties are impacted in this area?
In total for this study, for floodplains, for Lime Creek, and for the Stevens tributary, there's about 355 properties that are affected by the floodplain.
And then you mentioned that you're going to be sending some correspondence out to these properties, correct?
Yes.
Via mail?
Yep. So there'll be individual letters that go out to all the affected property owners that basically kind of, the first sheet, it kind of explains what's all going on with this project, that, you know, expect some changes with the floodplain mapping. And then the next page has a little exhibit basically showing their property, what the existing floodplain is and what the new floodplain is going to be.
Great. And then if there are any questions, because I anticipate some people will be calling Darla, Drew, and myself, since this is primarily our area, we direct it to Public Works. Was I correct in understanding that?
Yes.
Okay. Is there anything that Public Works will be doing as like an informational session, or do we just anticipate just dealing it on a case-by-case basis?
Go ahead, Mr. Taggart.
That's what we're doing today. But no, as far as having like an open house, a community open house, we're not going to do that in this instance. Since there are so many people being removed, we've had the best success with individual letters to property owners and then those one-on-one conversations if they have questions. So Mary has dealt with this on a number of times, and she's excellent at working with individual property owners if they have questions.
Indeed, and she's very good with working with council members as well. And then just to make sure my notes are correct, we believe this will all be finalized. You said after April 4th, so we should have that all easily accessible through the rapid map, say by May, the latest?
Yep, so expect about a couple of weeks after that April 4th, that's when Rapid Map will get updated.
Wonderful. Okay, thank you very much. I'll yield.
Thank you. Do we have anybody else that has any questions?
I have a question. Exactly what accounts for the 40 structures that have been dropped from that 100-year floodplain? What changes made that happen?
So when FEMA first initially went through here, I can kind of go through some of this mapping. They used basically the best information they had at the time. So they had some form of hydrologic model determining how much water is actually going through that area. Then they also had some type of hydraulic model that needed some type of topography information, you know, your hills, valleys, determine where that's all at. Basically using some of that older information that you have, you don't get the detail that you have right now. With the old, they're basically USGS maps. The detail that you have is if Rapid City wasn't here and you were planning out Rapid City and had this maps, it gives you a good ballpark of, oh, here's, you know, my flooding areas. But once you start, you know, developing and putting all that in, you need a little more detail of exactly, you know, if I put this house here, am I going to be into a flooding issue, or, you know, what's all going on? By using the LIDAR data, that 2015 LIDAR data, basically instead of being, you know, possibly tens of feet, you know, off, you're just talking about a few inches here and there. So, I mean, there's a lot more detail that ends up going in here.
And this study did not go into reassessing that area up by Pierce Street and the end of West Chicago that feeds into this. Is that what you're referring to as the Stevens tributary, or is?
Stevens tributary is, let's see, the easiest part is, so we have Susan Drive and South Street. Basically everything west of that intersection that you see right here on the screen, that is the Stevens tributary that goes through a portion of Brookside Drive. Then the rest of Lime Creek is basically from Rapid Creek straight up north of the Sunken Gardens, basically, going up to St. Martin's.
Yes.
There were updates made to, that's the South Canyon drainage that you're referring to, Alderman Evans.
South Canyon drainage.
Yeah,
okay.
and
So
it becomes part of the Lime Creek drainage. That area was updated
Like 3 years ago, I want to say.
3 or 4 years ago, so that work has already been done in that Pierce Street area.
Okay. All right, thank you.
Go ahead, Mr. Stroman.
Thank you. Where does Lime Creek originate? Is it up area?
So, yep, so let me show you kind of where it originates here. So the actual water that you're seeing is is actually coming up from a spring it comes up over by Wilderness Park. But the actual limits of where if basically water hit the land and it's going to go flow into Lime Creek is basically over in that St. Martin's Monastery area. You can kind of see St. Martin's is located there just northwest of that area is basically the limits of where everything now drains towards that Lime Creek area.
And how does it get to the southern, how does it cross East Chicago? Does it go underneath the street? Or is it
Under Chicago, there are multiple, there's multiple storm sewer going. There's a bypass, I think, that was put in about 10 to 15 years ago, and there's also one that crosses directly on the road, and then any flows higher than that will then go on the road and transported along the road section.
Okay, and at its widest, how wide is, do you know that? How wide is Lime Creek and at its narrowest?
The widest is basically over at the detention ponds. That would be over into the north part of the town. That'd be over by the St. Martin's Village area, and I want to say that's probably a good 200 so feet wide, but again, that's a detention cell, so I mean, it's meant to hold water. And then at its narrowest, you're probably looking at the, 50 feet or so wide, depending on where you're looking at, just from what I can remember what's on there. But yeah, there's some channels in there that that are about 50 foot wide or so that can hold all that water.
Okay, and then it flows through a park and over by the baseball fields?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep. Over there by the Sunken Gardens, that's where that's the creek.
Okay, and has there been issues with flooding on it? That you're aware
There
of?
is some mapping from flooding issues back when the 1972 flood happened. There was, some significant amount of rain that also happened through other parts of Rapid City. And I believe there, in some of the old drainage studies, there were some mapping in this area where there was some drainage issues found where there was some flooding that happened. If you take a look, we have the Drainage Basin Design Plan, I believe, for this area. It talks a little bit about those areas that were mapped.
Okay, thank you, that's all I have.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, do you have any questions? If not, I think I thank you very much for giving us that.
Yep,
and I
thanks for
think
having me.
That's it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to Mr. Tech. I imagine you've got one or two things you would like to talk about, too.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll actually just speak on item 2, and then I believe City Engineer Mr. Benganji will speak to the remaining Public Works items, and then Director Biegler is here, has, I think, the last item on the agenda. So item number 2 is a permit modification that we have to submit to the state. We need to do some work on our gas collection flare out at the landfill. They're very specific about how we dispose of the methane gas that's collected in the landfill. So we've got a CIP project coming up to address that. So the purpose of this is just to modify our permit to make us eligible and available to make the modifications that we need.
Yeah, as Dale said, I'll be speaking on items 3 through 9. And you've just heard a very good presentation for Paul. Thanks, Paul, on item number 3 for the Lime Creek. Item number 4 is a progress change order for our Elkvale Force Main and Lift Station Sewer Project. Item number 5 is for our contract administration services for our box culvert replacement on St. Patrick Street. Number 6 is for professional services for right-of-way and easement acquisitions for our Jackson Boulevard and West Main Street intersection project. 7 is for advertising for bids, actually for construction, for our trenchless sanitary sewer rehab projects. And then 8 and 9 are exceptions to the 40-unit rule, which staff approves of. So if you have any questions on all these, I'm here to answer.
So I'm not getting anything in on my computer, so if you want to speak, Pat? All right.
Thank you very much. Question on item 4, if I may. The change order increase, $237,000 is a significant amount of change. Were there equipment issues or unanticipated things that came up, or what's bringing that to $237,000? Thank you.
If I may, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, this Elkvale Lift Station project, it's a significant project. I believe it was close to $8 million project. As part of the bid award and discussions with the contractor, there was an issue with pipe bedding and then supply chain issues, believe it or not. We had a heck of a time finding fittings for this project worldwide. So the bulk of this change order is for a bedding change that was required based on some inaccuracies in the plan, but this is necessary to ensure that our design life of 100 years is met on this project. We only get one opportunity to do this right, so that necessitated this change order. So that's the bulk of the changes. There were some other items in there, and we're not done with change orders on this project, and I anticipate we'll find opportunities as the project moves along to actually decrease costs. So I believe the net effect of the project will be less than what you're seeing today.
And I don't see anybody else that has any questions. Laura, do you have any questions?
No, sir.
Oh, Greg just came in. Go ahead, Greg.
I don't know if this is for Ben or for Dale, but what's a trenchless sanitary sewer rehab? What?
Yeah, it's just a method of construction. Normal method is open cut, where we actually trench and, affect the access by actually having an open trench. This method here is going to be by pipe bursting. We'll have a hole dug on each side of our construction limits, and we'll actually send in this pipe burster and replace the pipe without actually doing any kind of trenching. And this is a common method that we try to employ as much as possible when we have that opportunity.
Usually more economical to do that than to do the trenching, or?
If you factor in a lot of the disruption to our traveling public, it's probably going to be close. But I don't necessarily know. We've already kind of come through that, and we like to limit our disruption to this public. And this is actually in a park that we've done a lot of work in there already, so we take into all of those things.
Okay.
I've got a couple comments, if you don't mind, to add to that. Trenchless installation, if you're in an area where you have a lot of connections to the sewer, it doesn't work really well because you're blowing apart everyone's connection. So there's not any advantage to doing trenchless technology, say, on a regular street project. But if you're in an area like this, parks, there aren't any connections to the line, it's much easier to do that trenchless technology. And the benefit of it is there's less ground disturbance. It's underground. There still is some disturbance because you need to do work at all the manholes and get your equipment in and out. Cost-wise, it can be lower, but not necessarily. It's a whole different effort, and we'll find out when we open bids how competitive it is. But certainly in the park, near the floodplain, we want to make sure that we're disturbing the least amount that we can. And I'm sure Mr. Beekler would be happy that we're not tearing up his parks. So.
And I will add one more thing, that it's a newer technology that we're talking about. And so with the availability of this, those prices are becoming more and more economical for us. When this first started, it was not necessarily something we used all that often, but we use it more and more with the increased availability of this technology. So,
Thank you. Any other questions? If not, Mr. Beekler?
Yes, thank you. Item number 10 is requesting advertising authority for a stream bank stabilization project on Rapid Creek in the Meadowbrook Golf Course. This is a section of the creek that's been eroding and is in need of stabilization and repair. It is encroaching into getting close to one of the cart paths there, so it's time to address this. We do have funding in our Parks and Recreation CIP for this project.
Thank you. Do we have anyone that has any questions on this? If not, I will go back and I'll look for a motion on these items. Got a motion to approve items 1 through 10. All in favor? Aye. All opposed? Motion passes.
Move to adjourn.
Got a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Aye. Thank you.